Few things have proven to be more crippling to a Democratic Party presidential incumbent than a serious primary challenge, especially when that primary challenge comes from the heralded Kennedy family. Back in 1968, the success of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s primary challenge, based on his opposition to Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam, forced Lyndon Johnson to announce that he wouldn't even seek the nomination for the Democratic primary because his defeat became almost inevitable. In 1980, Edward Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts, challenged the Democratic incumbent Jimmy Carter, and though he ended up losing, Carter ended up severely debilitated by that very contested primary challenge, and though he won, he ended up getting destroyed by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. Now Joe Biden has two primary challengers who are announced, both apparently, according to Democratic voters, reasonably credible. One, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of California Senator Robert Kennedy, who forced Lyndon Johnson out of the 1968 race, as well as the author Marianne Williamson, already familiar to Democratic voters because she previously ran for office for the president in 2020. Now, when I say the strategy of the Democratic Party in the face of this primary challenge is simply to pretend that it's not happening, to just insist that Joe Biden has no primary challengers, even though he does, and therefore no debate will ever be sponsored by the Democratic National Committee, I really mean that. I'm not exaggerating. Here is current MSNBC host and former Joe Biden White House aide and Kamala Harris White House aide, Simone Sanders, who was asked by Joe Scarborough what the Democratic Party and the DNC intend to do about these primary challenges. And you can listen in her own words to the extreme arrogance and hubris of what she said, the contempt that they have for the Democratic Party voter. Listen to what she told them.
Bobby Kennedy Jr., doing well. He's at 19%. Hasn't really gotten that much out there. I mean, and I'm starting to hear more and more talk about him. Are we going to actually have a challenge here?
I'm trying not to laugh, Joe. There's not going to
Wait,
be.
can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Do you know how many people said the same thing about Donald Trump in 2015 on this show?
Except
said
I will
the
note,
same exact thing.
Yes, because there was going to be a Republican primary. But I really think that the mealy-mouthed Democrats, as I like to call them, and some of my progressive friends who would like to live in a fantasy land, they need to come back to reality. Yeah. And the reality is this. The sitting president of the United States of America is a Democrat that would like to run for re-election, so much so that he has declared a re-election campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. There will be no debate stage for Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson, or anyone else to stand on.
So we're going to have another Bobby Kennedy in an empty chair in the debate, right?
There will be no debate.
Yeah, no debate.
The Democratic National Committee administers the debates, and they're not going to set up a primary process for debates for someone to challenge the head of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. David, a lot of Democrats concerned about Joe Biden. They may not be saying it in front of the television camera, but man, get those cameras off.
No, there's two amazing ironies of that. The first is she accused her progressive friends, whoever she meant, or these mealy-mouthed Democrats, of living in a fantasy world. Right afterwards, she just got done announcing, after hearing that 20% of Democratic voters support not Joe Biden to be the party's nominee, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and another 8% support Marianne Williamson. So that's almost 1 out of every 3 Democratic voters who are announcing their support for a different candidate other than Joe Biden. She said there will be no primary race. There will be no debate. She is pretending they don't exist. Who's living in the fantasy world? But the other irony is these are the people who constantly tell you that they are the guardians of democracy. They want to preserve democratic values. And that the contempt they have for the democratic process, for their own voters, they don't even bother to hide it anymore. She just said, I don't care how many people prefer Robert Kennedy Jr. or Marianne Williamson or any other candidate. Joe Biden will be the nominee. Or, in other words, it's not the Democratic Party voters who determine the nominee. It's people like her, and it's already decided it's Joe Biden. There's no need to have an election. He's the nominee, regardless of what Democratic Party voters want. How self-hating do you have to be to listen to party leaders say that right to your face and continue to support this party that makes clear that they don't care in any way what it is that you think or want? Now, a new poll today, this was from May, so this is from a couple of weeks ago. There's a new poll today from CNN that is even worse for Joe Biden. It is not only another poll that has Robert F. Kennedy Jr. this time at 20%, not 19%, and Marianne Williamson at 8%. So continuing to show substantial support for candidates other than Joe Biden within the Democratic Party. It's also a devastating poll for Joe Biden. Among other things, it has him at a 35% favorability rating, the lowest for any American president in the first term since Dwight Eisenhower 70 years ago. And one way you know this poll was so devastating for Joe Biden is even CNN was forced to admit it. Here is Jake Tapper telling his audience what you know they do not want to hear, to the extent that there is such a thing as a CNN audience anymore. But the few who are still there definitely don't want to hear this message, and yet he had no choice given the clarity of this data to deliver it.
Horrible news, horrible for Joe Biden in our new CNN poll. While the president leads his Democratic competitors by a huge margin, 2/3 of all of the American people surveyed, 66% of the public, say that a Biden victory would either be a setback or a disaster for the United States.
Now, he suggests there that Joe Biden's lead is huge. It's actually not in the context of primary challenges to a sitting president. Donald Trump had primary challengers in 2020, people like former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld and former South Carolina governor who resigned in disgrace and then ended up running for the House seat that he held, Mark Sanford, and losing in the primary. He was a joke of a candidate, and they never got anywhere near 20%, even though supposedly a significant portion of the party was found Trump so anathema. And as I said, there are a lot of polls that show Ron DeSantis at a lower number of support than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has at 16% and 18%. I saw a South Carolina poll today where Trump was above 50% and DeSantis was at 15%. And yet everybody acknowledges, and I think they should, that there's a real Republican primary, the outcome of which we won't know until the voting is counted. But if you think that about the Republican Party, you have to think that about the Democratic Party, given that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is polling higher, in some polls at least, than Ron DeSantis, but has roughly the same level of support. And everyone regards Ron DeSantis as at least a credible primary challenger. Nobody would say Donald Trump is about a primary challenger. This is a fairy tale, a mythology that they have invented. Now, here's CNN talking about its own poll. It has this hilariously optimistic headline, quote, Biden has a lead over Democratic Party challengers, but faces headwinds overall. Quote, just a third of Americans say that Biden winning in 2024 would be a step forward or a triumph for the country. At the same time, the survey finds a decline in favorable views of Biden over the past 6 months, from 42% in December to 35% now. And results from the same poll released earlier this week showed Biden's approval rating for handling the presidency at 40%, among the lowest for any first-term president since Dwight Eisenhower at this point in their term. In other words, you have to go back to the 1950s to find a president with as low approval ratings in the first term at this point in the presidency as Joe Biden has. There's no way to certify that. Within his own party, 60% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters say they back Biden for the top of next year's Democratic ticket. 20% favor activist and lawyer Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and 8% back author Marianne Williamson. Another 8% said they would support an unnamed someone else. Now, one of the things I find extremely interesting about the challenge from RFK Jr. in particular, and I said this to Marianne Williamson when I had her on this show, and I'm going to have RFK Jr. on within the next week or two. We're finalizing dates. Looking forward to that discussion. is that the way in which that last primary challenge against the Democratic incumbent proved to be successful, it wasn't just RFK Jr. who drove Lyndon Johnson out of the race, but also Eugene McCarthy, was because there was a war going on that the Democratic Party president supported, and they exploited anti-war sentiment to mount a challenge against him. Marianne Williamson has no differences or criticisms at all of Biden's proxy war policy in Ukraine. She supports it, in fact, vehemently. But RFK Jr. is a vehement and vocal opponent of that war policy. He finds the war in Ukraine to be recklessly disastrous, recklessly dangerous, in a way that produces no benefits for the American people and all kinds of harms. But it's not just in that very important issue where he presents a stark choice, and therefore a crucial debate, where Biden would be forced to defend this war policy, even though Biden himself said it has brought the war closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point since 1962. His own policy, that is, has done that. But also the widespread lies and errors and damage done in the name of COVID, which Biden has vehemently supported. So let Biden go before the Democratic Party electorate and justify school closures that have caused a retardation in the intellectual and emotional and cognitive development of millions of American children, or the fact that lies were told about the efficacy of cloth masks and what the vaccine would do and how it works. That's why the Democrats are petrified of a debate, because they actually have a real contrast. Now, let me say on a show a few days ago when I was just sort of talking about RFK Jr.'s candidacy in passing, I mentioned that there are certain things that I disagree with him on, including what I called his vehement support for Russiagate. His campaign got in contact with me and said they thought that was wildly overstated, even a little inaccurate, or maybe entirely inaccurate in their view. And we checked more than I did before I said that. It was kind of an off-the-cuff comment I made, and I have to say that at the very least my formulation was excessive. I don't think it's fair to call him a vehement supporter of Russiagate. You can find a couple of tweets that can be interpreted as supportive and a couple of tweets that are skeptical, and I'm going to refrain from characterizing that any further until I have RFK Jr. on the show, where he can talk himself about what his position was and what it is now when it comes to Russiagate. But clearly the Democrats are petrified of the debate that he brings. This is a serious person. He was an environmental lawyer for 20 years, widely regarded among the left liberals for doing an important job. He knows what he's talking about. We showed you that interview he did with Crystal Ball on Breaking Points, where she tried to tell him he was wrong on vaccines, but was ill-prepared to tell him why, and admitted he had done far more work than she had in researching it. He wrote an entire book on it that became a New York Times bestseller, filled with references to hundreds of studies and thousands of footnotes. Imagine Joe Biden having to engage him on that debate. So of course they're going to do everything possible to keep Biden hidden, like they did in 2020. But as poll numbers like this continue to grow, and he becomes a weaker and weaker and weaker candidate, barely able to speak a coherent sentence, oftentimes clearly not having any idea what he's saying, the ability to sustain this fairy tale is going to crumble even more. Now, let me show you a speech that Biden gave at the G7 just last week that was, despite him reading from a script, cringeworthy and difficult to watch, uncomfortable. Because what he was saying, the words that were coming out of his mouth, were incoherent. So imagine him trying to do that in a debate. Whatever medication they gave him in 2020 that got him through those debates seemed not to be working any longer. Listen to him try and read from a script.
And there's a lot of other, for example, the idea that we're, in terms of taxes, that they refuse to, for example, I was able to balance the budget and pass everything from the global warming bill. Anyway, I was able to cut by $1.7 billion in the first 2 years the deficit that we were accumulating. And because I was able to say to it that the 55 corporations in America that made $400 billion, or $40 billion, $400 billion, that they pay zero in tax, zero.
That was a 40-second clip. He mentioned no fewer than 7 issues, none of which had anything to do with the prior one. He threw out numbers that made no sense, that were clearly wrong. He had no idea what those numbers meant. He continuously interrupted himself with like whatever and moving on. He couldn't complete a sentence. Even though this was scripted, you see him here reading the speech, looking down. He had a script in front of him. He couldn't even read from it. His cognitive decline is something that was alerted to, warned about, trumpeted, not by Trump supporters or Bernie Sanders supporters in 2018 when he was gearing up to run, but by Democratic insiders on Morning Joe who were petrified he was going to get the nomination due to name recognition, only to be able to be exposed as somebody whose brain is melting. That was 5 years ago. This is going to be another year and a half, another year before he starts running. How are they going to present him, prop him up in order to make him even acceptable to watch, let alone people willing to vote for him again? And if he has to go through the rigors of a Democratic primary where he gets exposed even more, where he gets weakened even more, where his energy is devoted to that, where he gets exposed like this over and over, it is very hard to see how he ends up as even a viable candidate, let alone one that Democrats are going to have confidence in, but Democratic voters themselves see it. It's very possible the more they learn about RFK Jr. and his position on vaccines, that support will disappear. But Democratic voters clearly are petrified of supporting and nominating Joe Biden and are very uncomfortable watching him and extremely unfavorable about how he's governing this country, let alone independents and Republicans. To the point where even CNN is calling polling data disastrous. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.